Hi everyone, my name is Morgan Bimm and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to my PopCon paper titled Bella Swan Listens to Muse, 2000s Girl Culture and the Amplification of Indie Rock. Sometime last year, as the decade quietly drew to a close and we had the audacity to hope for smoother sailing in 2020, it finally became cool to admit to loving the Twilight soundtracks. In a mid-2019 interview with USA Today, actor Robert Pattinson called the 5 soundtracks, quote, quite ahead of their time, and remarked that they've become quite the hip thing to like. Twilight was one of several 2000s franchises to embrace the use of indie and alternative music, a trend arguably started when Alexander Petsavis, the film's music supervisor, got her start 5 years earlier working on the OC. Today, texts like Twilight and the OC are allowed a certain degree of recuperability on the basis of nostalgia and having good music, while other texts lose credibility if enjoyed in earnest. In this presentation, I'll argue that the selective mode of remembering 2000 soundtracks, namely as separate from the film and television franchises they are attached to, is consistent with indie rock's aversion to citational politics and canonicity. If we understand mid-2000s indie music as a genre defined by its proximity to a particular kind of culturally literate, white, middle-class straight masculinity, we can posit the deliberate curation of, for instance, the Twilight saga's indie-heavy soundtracks as a strategic distancing from the feminized, faddish, or what Susan Cook terms the abject popular cultural texts that marked this era. Rather than read the indie soundtracks of 2000s girly franchises as an attempt to elevate or add cultural value to the lowbrow genres of feminized media texts, I argue that the gulf between the two is exacerbated in how we perform nostalgia for these soundtracks. In other words, understanding or appreciating 2000s indie, separate from its ties to 2000s girl culture, is not only inadvisable in terms of representational politics, it also contributes to a much longer history of subcultural studies that often leaves out questions of systemic oppression and erasures. In Angela McRobbie and Jenny Garber's foundational analysis of gender in youth subcultures, originally published in 1977, they argued that girls tended to be less represented in popular understandings of youth subcultures, largely because they were less visible in the public space where we understand those cultural practices to occur. Teen girls, the authors argue, were more likely to experience and consume culture in private spaces, such as their bedrooms, where, quote, there is more room for a great deal of new teenage consumer culture. Indie music, despite being a genre dominated by white masculinity, subverts those gendered assumptions of space. Indie's predicated in many ways on, quote, an alleged refusal to participate, and a particular kind of cultural capital or aesthetics that proceeds from an exiled cultural stance. Ryan Hibbett writes in his article, pointedly titled What is Indie Rock?, that indie music consciously privileges a kind of, quote, bedroom sound, without ever referencing McRobbie and Garber's concept of bedroom culture. Hibbett's excavation of indie rock, one of the only pieces of ethnomusicology theory to address the genre explicitly, is not the only one to make reference to bedrooms. Cotton Sealer notes that the best indie music is more appropriate for, quote, bedroom contemplation than dance floor abandon. These new modes of listening were part of a widely understood move from the garage rock of the 60s and 70s towards the bedroom rock of the following decades, which was much different both sonically and ideologically, tending to rely on a more muted mode of performing both one's masculinity and musical prowess. These attempts from male scholars and indie rock aficionados to describe indie values and aesthetics erase, or more likely fail to register, girl studies writing around similar questions of space, authenticity, cultural production, and belonging. This ongoing failure is a theoretical microcosm of bigger issues. In other words, indie rock bros are categorically invested in reproducing indie rock, as having as little to do with girls or girl culture as possible. Before we jump into unpacking that relationship, though, a quick word about girls and girl studies. The boundary of girl studies and girl culture are widely contested, and rightly so. It's language that can be fraught with gender essentialism and often ignores intersections of race, class, sexuality, and so many other identity markers that define who gets to experience girlhood. The persistent whiteness of the 2000s texts I study and their assumed audiences is staggering, and if white girlhood is constructed as culturally inferior, then the narratives of racialized girls who are fans of these same texts are marginalized further still. One additional benefit to the cyclical nostalgia for 2000s music has been the reclamation of racialized, queer, and otherwise other modes of girlhood that were poorly represented at the time. Rock subgenres of this era, from indie to emo, were steeped in whiteness, and there's tons of incredible scholarship and popular press out there on the interplay between masculinity and whiteness that plays out in alternative music scenes. As recently as the summer, in the context of the Black Lives Matter actions taking place around the world, calling attention to anti-Black racism and police brutality, Emo Night LA hosted 2 panels on race in the punk and alternative music scenes, and you can view those panels in full on their YouTube channel. Even hegemonic girlhood, however, is threatening to masculinist indie rock scenes. And so it does present an interesting juxtaposition that so much of the music we would now categorize as archetypical 2000s indie only made it to the ears of young fans via soap operas and rom-coms, historically feminized genres of media typically understood as made for a girlier audience. In Matthew Bannister's writing on indie rock masculinities, he notes that the gatekeeping tendencies of indie manifests in its tendency to downplay ideas of canonicity, despite rock canons providing a strong foundation for the indie sound. Not only that, but this constant striving for aesthetic purity or independence is reflected in the genre's understanding of gender. According to Bannister, quote, "Denial of influence was a way of reproducing the autonomy of the scene through rejection of a feminized nostalgia. If nostalgia is feminized or viewed as weakness, we can start to appreciate the impulse to recover or recuperate 2000s indie rock sanitized of its cultural contexts, namely its intimate ties with 2000s girl culture." The centering of indie rock sensibilities on Twilight and other 2000s era media has been framed at times as a major blow to the authenticity and cultural capital that had defined the genre up until that point. Indie is unique in that its parameters are always understood to be bounded by the technical industrial specifics of the music's production and social location rather than the style of music itself. As Simon Frith observes, indie, quote, refers to a means of production and to an attitude, supposedly embodied in the music, in its listeners, and perhaps most importantly, in the relationship between them. Its inclusion in TV and film soundtracks, then, represented for many the beginning of a steady erosion of these boundaries, arguably compounded by the end of the intermediary 2000s and the rise of streaming services such as Spotify and Apple Music. This narrative is further complicated by the fact that, for every person who felt scandalized by the commercialization of indie, there's somebody who felt inspired and seen by the same unlikely conflation of 2000s girl culture and indie rock. In a 2018 Uproxx article titled "The Twilight Movies Introduced a Generation of Girls to Indie Music," writer Chloe Gilkey notes that, quote, "The first time I heard a Radiohead song was at a midnight premiere for a movie about teenage vampires." For Gilkey, the indie music included in the Twilight films represented, quote, "portals to a new world," one that she was previously uncomfortable feeling entitled to on the basis of so much of indie rock's masculinist gatekeeping of male-coded space. The inclusion of artists such as Bon Iver, St. Vincent, and Muse on Twilight soundtracks made Gilkey feel welcome, and she notes that she might not have pursued a career writing about music without the reassurance that that music had a place for her. Although only one woman's experience, Gilkey's fond memories of these soundtracks and their bolstering of her confidence as a fan speaks volumes, pun very much intended, of the affective intensity of feeling included, validated, and seen by a musical genre that rarely invites girls into its upper ranks. Pat Savis's work on popular girly franchises of the early and mid-2000s turned an entire generation of media fans into what sociologists Peterson and Kern have called cultural omnivores, but couldn't have possibly foreseen the cultural turn she set off by doing so. Rather, according to anecdotes from the OC's early days, Pat Savis picked the songs for this show's first season from her personal iPod, proving that the original intent of Pat Savis's soundtracks was, like Gilkey, finding more space for herself in the media that she loved. For my dissertation research, I got to interview female music supervisors like Dondrea Ira, who spoke about her decision to pursue music supervision largely because she saw trailblazers like Pat Savis and Lindsay Wolfington of One Tree Hill soundtrack fame leading the way. A quote from one of our interviews here. Not that I was subconsciously thinking this whenever I was younger, but looking back on it now, it's like the people who were involved in shaping the soundtracks that literally were my high school soundtracks, my life, and I'm sure your life and everybody else's who was in our age group, were women, and that's pretty amazing. Today, in the parts of Twitter I frequent, worthy of an OC soundtrack is high praise for new music. There's been a wave of articles celebrating this era of girl cultural texts, including an overdue reclamation of Jennifer's Body and its perfect campy depiction of indie musicians desperate for a break. The music, too, has experienced a resurgence in keeping with nostalgia's 20-year cycles. The Strokes, who marked for many the start of the New York garage rock revival in the early 2000s, put out an album at the start of the year, and Bright Eyes is set to release theirs by its end. A new wave of indie musicians is also signaling their allegiance to the mid-2000s canon, after seeing her songs covered by both The Killers and Death Cab for Cutie frontman Ben Gibbard, and coming off a year spent touring a collaborative album with Bright Eyes' Connor Oberst, singer-songwriter Phoebe Bridgers tweeted, "Don't need any more proof that tweenage me was a powerful indie rock witch." In retrospect, the question of which 2000s indie rock acts are remembered or not have little to do with how ethically pure the bands were, how closely they did or didn't live up to the indie ethos of authenticity and resisting commercialization. The bands that were remembered are those that found a way into the everyday lives of people. Performing nostalgia for one canon, 2000s indie rock, without acknowledging its embeddedness in another, 2000s girl culture, perpetuates a historical trajectory of subculture studies and rock histories that forgoes systemic level analysis, too deeply invested in reproducing narratives of autonomy, the male genius, and neoliberal individual cultural subjects. Girls in girl culture has a great track record of recognizing the quotidian value of media. It's no surprise that indie rock sailed into the mainstream via soap operas and vampire movies, media forms sure to breach bedroom walls and inspire lifelong fandom for some and stubborn soft spots for others. But remembering these soundtracks as a fluke or ahead of their time only does a disservice to the women and girls who understood that pairing indie rock with girl culture packed a 1-2 punch, demonstrating the porousness of indie rock in the absence of masculinist gatekeeping and enduring cinematic masterpieces, catchy as a pop song, but doomed to be remembered only by virtue of their cool indie soundtracks, rather than their real and lasting impact on the girls who loved them. Thank you so much.